With the recent announcement of a new Dead Space coming soon, I wanted to go back to the original game and see if it still holds up alongside my memories. The short answer is, yeah, it's really good and it's still worth playing even today. There are a few things that irk me, like gameplay balancing and annoying audio issues, but for the most part, this is a fun game. I had a good time from start to finish. In the far-off future of 2508, a mining ship known as the USG Ishimura mysteriously goes quiet. The protagonist, Isaac Clarke, is part of a small crew sent to investigate, but upon arriving and after a very rough landing, everyone is quickly ambushed by monsters. While Isaac is also searching for his girlfriend who was part of the Ishimura's crew, it's otherwise decided that escaping the ship immediately would be the best course of action. And of course, along the way, everyone slowly learns the backstory of what happened on board the Ishimura. The story is pretty bland. Not bad by any means, but extremely predictable. A ton of clues are laid out constantly, but the big plot twists at the end still act like a major reveal. It comes off as a second viewing kind of thing, like, oh, I didn't notice that the first time, except no one is going to miss it the first time around anyway. It's really obvious where the story is going. The plot has progressed thanks to decently acted dialogue, both between characters active in the story and voice recordings left behind by the Ishimura crew. Text documents are typical for horror games, and they're kept simple and to the point while still being fun to read. Unlike in Tormented Souls where the text was overly descriptive and went on forever, Dead Space's notes are much more concise. And yeah, while the plot isn't anything special, it is a fun story to go through and see how it all plays out. But aside from the plot, what really stands out is the setting and the atmosphere. There's no doubt that Dead Space was inspired by movies like Alien, Event Horizon, and maybe some Hellraiser 4 Bloodlines in there too. But they've definitely created an identity very much its own. What I find most striking about Dead Space, if this is going to make any sense, is how medieval everything looks. Isaac's suit is the most direct example to me. As you upgrade it throughout the game, it slowly gets more armored, and his helmet is designed with an eye slit. Not only that, but the armor doesn't just come in plates, it's instead segmented, acting as a very literal exoskeleton. Not a typical futuristic exoskeleton that might act as additional supporting arms and legs, but rather a literal skeleton attached to the outside. Like a second skin that's basically a set of iron bones. Even Dead Space's famous health display is formed along the curvature of Isaac's spine, and is segmented into discs. The whole thing looks like some nightmarish medieval knight in armor. I think it's unique and looks great. The rooms of the Ishimura reflect this dark fantasy approach as well, with plenty of moody lighting that peers through narrow openings and window blinds. Many of the walls also have a lot of sharp edges, to the point where it's practically comical. There's even a room where some walls inexplicably have large spikes protruding from them. The Ishimura may not be an entirely realistic place to live and work, but it does a great job at reflecting the themes that the game is going for. There's a lot of cross-section between religion and science in this game, examining a line between theory and faith, and this can be seen in the architecture. It kind of looks like a hellish cathedral in places. Reminds me a little bit of Doom, although, again, Dead Space does a good job at making the look its own. While the actual story itself is whatever, I do like the universe and lore that this first entry has created. That said, there is one last thing that needs to get brought up about the game's presentation. The audio is pretty terrible. Generally speaking, this game is extremely loud. Not just for the typical jump scares, but everything is just way too loud to the point of being obnoxious. Monsters will scream after they've clearly already died and stopped moving, and this can be exacerbated if they're killed while in slow motion. On the other hand, the monsters are also dead silent when they're trying to sneak up on you. It might seem weird at first, but it is clearly designed this way intentionally, and it works out well enough for the most part. But the point is that there's a very annoying juxtaposition between times when the game is quiet to when it's suddenly ear-screechingly loud. I can see that they're trying to be scary in that sense, but it comes off as more irritating than anything else. Perhaps even worse than that is the soundtrack. The background music is very generic, horror, Hollywood sounding kind of stuff. Not necessarily bad, but it is uninspired, which is a shame compared to the visual design. The way it's implemented is lazy too. Certain areas will have thresholds where the music arbitrarily stops and starts, regardless of what's actually happening in the game. None of this is a deal breaker, but it does bring down the overall quality. From a publisher and a potential budget as large as what Electronic Arts should have, this is unacceptable. I will say that the sound design when you're in a space vacuum is awesome. It does that typical muted audio kind of effect.
You're doing great, Isaac. Centrifuge and gyros are both 100% and stabilized. Now get out of there and focus on the engine. I don't know how much time we have left.
I can't imagine that there's a whole lot that can go wrong with that anyway, but it is still pretty cool. The gameplay is about on par with the presentation, and I mean that for both better and worse. It's that typical slower-paced third-person shooter, a style that was popularized by Resident Evil 4. In fact, this game borrows very heavily from Resident Evil 4. Enemies drop supplies and money, new weapons and items can be purchased at a shop, and Isaac's equipment can be upgraded as you progress through the game, along with each weapon having 4 different stats to increase. Having been released 3 years after Resident Evil 4, I would find it a little hard to believe that this is all merely coincidental. That's perfectly fine, of course, as long as it's well done, but we'll get back to those similarities later. Dead Space's take on combat is unique in that it heavily emphasizes targeting limbs. Resident Evil 4 did this as well, but it only went as far as affecting the enemy in the short term. With Dead Space, dismembering a monster's limbs also affects how it approaches you until it eventually dies. Taking out a leg will have it slowly crawl towards you, and removing both arms will kill it outright. This isn't just a neat gimmick either. You deal the most damage by targeting the limbs, so combat is often based around slowly disabling your enemies. Either kill one quickly, or immobilize a group of them to make the battle more manageable. It's a really cool concept that plays out well, although in practice, each fight kind of plays out the same way anyway. You shoot off one of the legs and then finish them off while they're on the ground. But that being said, it is still cool to have weak spots scattered across a body, as opposed to only shooting for the head like in most other games. The enemy variety is pretty decent too. The typical zombie is the most common one, but the fat versions will severely punish the player for missing a shot and puncturing their stomach. There's a weird crawling monster that's fast and has awkward limb placement, and a mutant baby that can climb along walls and fire projectiles. Some of the enemies, however, they're not all that great. This human that's attached to a wall and spits out flesh turrets takes way too long to kill and is just annoying. The worst of them all are these swarms of tiny bugs. You're just running through the game headed towards your next objective and then, oh, whoops, I guess I'm dead now. They're so tiny, they appear suddenly and out of nowhere, and they drain all of your health in an instant. You're supposed to look around the environment for some explosive to blow them all up, but it all happens so fast that you'll always die the first time around. Still, it's hard to be too mad because Dead Space has an extremely forgiving checkpoint system. You never go back very far after you die. That, in and of itself, is another issue. If death has so little consequence, then the impact from the setting and the gameplay is lessened because of it. I'm not saying the game needs to be hard, but there is such an absence of challenge that I feel like I'm just going through the motions and I'm not all that excited about what's happening around me. I don't know, the game's still fun, I like shooting off limbs and whatnot. It's just that on the hard difficulty, and even on the unlockable impossible difficulty, it's a very easy game. The hardest parts are when you get surprised and surrounded. But once you know what to expect, it's easy to position yourself in preparation for the scripted enemy spawns. Going back to the Resident Evil 4 comparison, there's a good selection of weapons to choose from, including a flamethrower, an assault rifle, and a motorized saw blade, among others. Strangely, however, most of these weapons aren't very good, if not just straight up outclassed by the starting pistol of the game. One of the things that made Resident Evil 4 so good was juggling a small collection of weapons, ammo, and supplies, and deciding on the best course of action depending on the situation. You can have that with Dead Space, but the starting pistol is so good that you're better off sticking with that for the whole game. Your money is better spent on upgrading your armor and increasing the pistol's damage output, which can be maxed out really early on, and ammo for it is both cheap and plentiful. This all makes the different weapons pointless. I really am just better off sticking with my single starting pistol. This isn't so bad as the game is still fun, but it does make me wonder of what could have been. If they didn't want to balance the game around an arsenal, then go ahead and make the pistol the only gun, and instead maybe offer some different ammo types, or flesh out the pistol's utility more. Maybe if I could crouch and more precisely angle my shots, or charge up a single powerful shot. I don't know if any of this would actually be good, but I'm trying to think of what they could have done with the wasted potential. It's a shame because each weapon has two different firing modes, so they put some work into this, but it doesn't really matter because it's either not that effective or it's just straight up completely outclassed by the starting pistol. What's more unique to Dead Space are the stasis and kinesis abilities. With these, Isaac can either put a target in slow motion for a brief period of time, or grab and throw items from a distance. The main purpose for these is to solve puzzles, and they're reasonably effective for that, but putting enemies in slow motion is insanely powerful. If you're in a room with a stasis recharge station, then go ahead and slow down everyone, you've got an infinite supply of the stuff. It's not needed for combat, but it is super powerful and it only makes the game even easier. Part of this makes me wonder if it should have been included in the game at all, as it doesn't really add much, but I suppose that it is a neat feature. There are some boss fights, which is pretty cool, but two of them are killed in the same way. Just lure the boss zombie into a trap and keep him there until you can set it off. Another two bosses are these crazily oversized monstrosity, and those fights are pretty cool, but you also just go through the motions of a repeated pattern. Once you figure out the ways that the boss attacks and how to deal with them, then it's just a matter of rinse and repeat until it eventually dies. That's not so bad. I know it's a very video gamey thing, which is fine, but again, the game is so easy and it can get a little bit boring at times. Overall, if it weren't for the balancing issues, then I could see this game being something really special. But as it stands, you don't have much of a reason to use anything other than the most basic weapon, and once you get used to the game, the monsters aren't as much of a threat as they probably should be. The first chapter is pretty stingy with its supplies, but by the time you finish the second chapter, healing items and ammunition shouldn't really be a concern from then on. And with a total of 12 chapters in the game, you definitely lose the anxiety and pressure that a classic horror game like Resident Evil was so good at instilling. For all my complaints though, Dead Space is actually a good game. It's fun to shoot things, there's a lot to shoot at, and the game has an awesome look to it. The sound design brings down the presentation quality, which is unfortunate, but for the most part it still works out quite well. If you're a fan of horror settings, then I dare say that Dead Space is kind of a must-play. I wouldn't say it's one of the best, but it is very well made. If you just want an action game, then there are much better choices out there, but I'd still recommend this. I think Dead Space is a cool game that most people would enjoy. Thanks for watching my review on Dead Space.